In the early years of the 19th century, in a world where freedom was a privilege granted to few, a woman named Sojourner Truth rose from the depths of bondage to become one of the most powerful voices for justice in American history. Born into slavery as Isabella Baumfree in New York around 1797, her life began in a world defined by chains, cruelty, and silence. Yet from that silence, she would one day forge words so powerful that they would echo through generations, reshaping how America understood both race and womanhood. Sojourner's early years were marked by pain and loss. Torn from her family, sold multiple times, she endured the brutality of a system that viewed her as property. But within her burned a quiet strength. She learned not only to survive, but to see through the moral blindness of those who enslaved her. Freedom, to her, was not just the absence of chains, it was the right to speak, to move, to dream, and to be recognized as fully human. When New York abolished slavery in 1827, Sojourner walked away from her master's house with nothing but her faith. She took her daughter and left behind the name Isabella, choosing instead to call herself Sojourner Truth. The new name carried deep meaning. Sojourner, because she believed God had called her to travel and tell the truth. And Truth, because that was her weapon against oppression. She would become a preacher, an activist, and eventually one of the most recognizable women of her time, speaking to audiences that spanned race, class, and gender. The 1850s were a time of deep turmoil in America. The fight over slavery was intensifying, and the first women's rights movements were beginning to take shape. Yet even within those circles of progress, black women were often ignored. They were expected to stand behind the cause, not lead it. Sojourner saw the hypocrisy clearly. She understood that the same society that denied black men their liberty also denied women their equality. She refused to accept that either battle could be won separately. In 1851, at a women's rights convention in Akron, Sojourner rose to speak. The room was filled with white women demanding equality and men who doubted their cause. When she stepped to the podium, she was met with skepticism, even hostility. But when she began to speak, the room fell silent. Her voice, both tender and commanding, carried a message that shattered the illusions of superiority and weakness alike. "Ain't he a woman?" she asked. It was not just a question, it was a declaration. In that simple phrase, Sojourner forced her audience to confront the contradictions in their beliefs. She reminded them that she had plowed fields and planted crops, that she had endured the lash and the loss of her children, and yet she was every bit as much a woman as any of them. She had worked, fought, and suffered not as a fragile being, but as a human with strength, will, and grace. The beauty of Sojourner's words was their raw truth. She did not speak in lofty rhetoric or political theory. She spoke from lived experience, from the perspective of someone who had carried the double burden of being both black and female in a world that valued neither. Her speech became more than a defense of women's rights. It was a call for universal humanity. She did not demand sympathy. She demanded recognition. Her influence spread far beyond that single moment in Akron. Sojourner became a traveling orator, crossing states to speak at abolitionist meetings, churches, and community halls. She addressed audiences that often tried to silence her, but her courage disarmed them. People who came expecting to see a former slave instead found themselves in the presence of a philosopher, a woman whose mind was as powerful as her conviction. Throughout her life, she continued to link the struggles of freedom and equality. She worked with Frederick Douglass, urging him to remember that the fight for justice must include both men and women. During the Civil War, she recruited black soldiers for the Union Army and later met with President Abraham Lincoln to advocate for the rights of freed people. Even in her later years, she spoke about land reform, prison conditions, and the moral obligations of a nation that called itself free. But what truly made Sojourner remarkable was her unwavering faith in humanity. She believed that love, truth, and courage could dismantle the structures of hate. She was not merely a critic of injustice. She was a living example of resilience. Her life challenged the notion that those who suffer most are destined to remain silent. Instead, she proved that pain could become purpose, that a woman once enslaved could rise to become a beacon for all who sought liberation. Long after her death in 1883, Sojourner Truth's legacy continued to inspire generations of activists, from the suffragists who carried forward her vision to the civil rights leaders of the 20th century who invoked her name in their marches for justice. Her story reminds us that progress is never a single act, but a continuation of voices building upon one another. Every protest, every demand for equality, carries echoes of that question she asked in 1851. Today, when discussions of race and gender still stir deep divisions, her words remain timeless. "Ain't a woman" is not just a historical refrain, it is a moral compass, urging us to look beyond the surface of identity and to see the shared humanity in every person. Sojourner Truth's journey from slavery to national prominence embodies the truth that equality is not granted by law or power, but claimed through courage. In her life, we see the power of one voice to awaken conscience. In her question, we find the heartbeat of every struggle for justice. And in her truth, we recognize the enduring spirit of all who rise, speak, and refuse to be forgotten. There are moments in history when a single voice rises above the noise of injustice, and that voice changes everything. Imagine a crowded convention hall in 1851, the air thick with tension, filled with men who doubted women's strength and women who struggled to be heard. In that room stood one figure unlike any other. She had known the weight of chains, the loss of freedom, and the silence that comes from being told you are less than human. Yet she stood tall, unafraid, and spoke words that would echo through centuries. "Ain't a woman." This is the story of Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery who became one of the most powerful voices for freedom and equality in American history. Her journey was not one of comfort or privilege, but of relentless courage and faith. From the fields of New York to the stages of national conventions, she transformed personal pain into a message that demanded the world to look at itself and change. Before she became Sojourner Truth, she was known as Isabella Baumfree. Her childhood was stolen by the cruel trade of human bondage, yet her spirit refused to break. When she finally gained her freedom, she could have chosen a quiet life away from struggle. But instead, she chose to fight not with anger or violence, but with conviction and truth. She believed that her purpose was to declare the truth to the people, and she did exactly that. Her words were not rehearsed speeches written for applause. They were lived experiences spoken with fire and faith. Every time she stepped onto a stage, she carried the weight of millions whose stories had been silenced. Her message was simple but undeniable. Strength, dignity, and womanhood belonged to every person, regardless of color or status. What made Sojourner Truth extraordinary was not only her courage but her clarity. She saw how the struggles for racial justice and women's rights were deeply connected. She challenged her audiences to see that freedom meant nothing if it excluded half of humanity. Her 1851 speech was not just about women's rights, it was about redefining what it meant to be human in a world that had forgotten its own humanity. As you watch this story unfold, you will see how one woman's voice sparked conversations that still matter today. Her life reminds us that history is not shaped by power alone, but by those who dare to speak when silence is easier. If her words still move you, if you believe stories like hers deserve to be told and remembered, then help this message reach more hearts. In the shadowed silence of a southern night, a young woman slipped through the darkness, guided only by faith and the faint glimmer of the North Star. Her name was Harriet Tubman, and though the world around her saw her as powerless, She was about to become one of the greatest symbols of courage and defiance in American history. Born into slavery in Maryland around 1822, Harriet's early life was marked by hardship, violence, and the constant threat of being torn from her family. But within her burned a quiet and unwavering belief that no one was ever meant to live in chains. That belief would lead her to risk everything, not just for herself, but for the freedom of others. Harriet's path to freedom began the moment she realized that survival was not enough. She had endured the lash, the endless toil of the fields, and the cruelty of those who saw her as property. Yet she had also listened to whispered hopes, to rumors of safe routes north, and to stories of people who had somehow found liberty beyond the borders of slavery. When the chance came, she did not hesitate. One night, with nothing but determination to guide her, she fled her master's plantation and began the perilous journey toward Pennsylvania, a free state. Every step she took was a battle against fear, every rustle of leaves a reminder that discovery meant death or return to bondage. Still, she pressed forward, trusting that God and courage would carry her through. When she finally crossed into freedom, Harriet later said she felt like she was in heaven. The air seemed sweeter, the sky white, and for the first time in her life, she belonged only to herself. But even in that moment of triumph, her heart was not at rest. She could not forget the faces of those still left behind, her family, her friends, her people. Freedom, she realized, was incomplete if she enjoyed it alone, so rather than stay safe, she turned back. It was a decision that defied logic and survival itself, but it defined the rest of her life. Harriet returned to the South again and again, leading small groups of enslaved men, women, and children through forests, swamps, and rivers, along what became known as the Underground Railroad. It was not an actual railroad, but a secret network of safe houses and courageous allies who risked their lives to help others escape. Harriet became known as the Moses of her people, a title that captured both her leadership and her faith. She carried no weapons except her resolve and a deep trust that the path of freedom was sacred. Still, she was practical. She carried a small pistol for protection, not from slave catchers, but to keep terrified escapees from turning back when the fear grew too strong. Over the years, she made 13 daring trips into the South and led more than 70 people to freedom. Remarkably, she never lost a single passenger. Her knowledge of terrain, her ability to read the stars, and her instincts for danger made her a master strategist. Slave catchers placed a high price on her head, but they never captured her. To the enslaved people who heard rumors of her deeds, she became a legend, a living symbol that freedom was possible, that resistance could triumph over fear. Her courage did not end with the Underground Railroad. When the Civil War erupted, Harriet saw it not as a distant conflict, but as the nation's reckoning with its own soul. She joined the Union cause, working first as a nurse and later as a spy and scout. Using the same skills that had guided her through the wilderness, she gathered intelligence behind enemy lines, helping Union troops navigate unfamiliar territory and plan attacks. In 1863, she played a crucial role in the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, leading Union gunboats through the marshes to attack Confederate positions and liberate more than 700 enslaved people in a single night. It was one of the largest mass emancipations of the war, and Harriet Tubman was the only woman to lead such a military operation. Despite her extraordinary service, Harriet never sought fame or recognition. She lived humbly, supporting herself through small jobs and donations from friends. But those who met her were struck by her strength, a quiet, unwavering strength born from a lifetime of purpose. She spoke little of her own bravery, saying only that she trusted the voice that guided her. Her faith was not blind. It was forged in struggle. It told her that freedom was worth any cost, and that courage, once awakened, could never be silenced. As the years passed and the war gave way to peace, Harriet continued to fight for justice in new forms. She became active in the movement for women's suffrage, standing alongside figures like Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth. To her, the fight for equality was one unbroken chain, stretching from the fields of slavery to the ballot box. She believed that liberty must belong to all or it belonged to none. Harriet Tubman's life remains one of the most remarkable examples of how one person's conviction can alter the course of history. She could not read or write, yet her intelligence outwitted generals and bounty hunters alike. She had no army, yet she led hundreds to freedom. She possessed no wealth, yet her legacy has enriched generations. Every time she stepped into danger, she did so knowing that her own life might be the price of another's freedom. And yet she went back, again and again, because she believed that the path to salvation for herself and her people lay not in safety, but in service. When she died in 1913, Harriet Tubman left behind no monuments, no fortune, and no grand titles. What she left instead was an unbreakable story, a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. Her life intertwined with that of Sojourner Truth and countless others who refused to accept the limits imposed upon them. Together, their voices became a chorus that carried across time, reminding every generation that freedom is not a gift to be received, but a responsibility to be claimed. In the decades following the Civil War, America stood at a crossroads between the promise of equality and the persistence of hatred. The nation had abolished slavery, yet freedom remained fragile, especially in the South, where new forms of oppression replaced the old. Fear and violence filled the void where justice should have been, and the most terrifying expression of that violence came in the form of lynching. In those dark years, when truth itself seemed under attack, a woman named Abby Wells picked up her pen and transformed it into a weapon more powerful than any mob, the weapon of truth. Born into slavery in 1862 in Mississippi, Ida's early life mirrored the struggle of a nation trying to redefine itself. Her parents, freed after the war, taught her that education was not only a right but a responsibility. When both her mother and father died in a yellow fever epidemic, she became the caretaker of her younger siblings at only 16. Even then, she refused to surrender to despair. She began teaching to support her family, a job that would lead her toward journalism and eventually toward one of the boldest fights for justice in American history. Ida's transformation from teacher to journalist began when she experienced injustice firsthand. In 1884, she was forcibly removed from a train after refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger. A decade before Rosa Parks would face the same humiliation, that moment ignited in her a lifelong refusal to remain silent in the face of wrong. She began writing under the pen name Ola, using her words to expose discrimination, challenge stereotypes, and demand accountability from a society that claimed to be free. Her voice found a home in the newspaper Free Speech and Headlight, which she co-owned and edited in Memphis, Tennessee. From there, Ida began to investigate one of the most horrifying realities of her time, the lynching of black men and women across the South. These brutal acts were often justified with false claims, masking hatred as justice. While others looked away, Ida looked closer. She collected records, interviewed witnesses, and exposed the lies that fueled these atrocities. Her articles revealed that many victims were not criminals but successful business owners, labor organizers, or simply people who refused to bow to white supremacy. In 1892, tragedy struck close to home when three of her friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, were lynched after opening a grocery store that competed with a white-owned business. The grief and outrage that followed became the turning point of Ida's life. She wrote fearlessly about their murders, declaring that the true motive behind lynching was not justice, but the fear of black progress and independence. Her words were so powerful that they sparked national outrage and forced her to flee Memphis when an angry mob destroyed her printing press. Exile did not silence her. It only gave her message a wider reach. Ida took her campaign north, traveling across the United States and even to Europe to bring international attention to America's hidden terror. She published Southern Horrors and The Red Record, meticulously documenting hundreds of lynching cases with evidence and eyewitness testimony. Her work was revolutionary not only because of its moral courage, but because it used the tools of modern journalism to fight systemic injustice. In an age when most women were expected to remain quiet, and black women were rarely allowed to speak at all, Ida stood on stages and told the world the truth about what was happening in her country. Her investigations laid the groundwork for what would later become civil rights journalism. She showed that information could be a form of resistance, that exposure could bring accountability where the law had failed. She also understood the power of narrative, how stories could awaken empathy and spark change in ways that statistics alone could not. Every article she wrote carried the weight of those who could no longer speak for themselves. Through her pen, the silenced found a voice. Ida's activism extended beyond her writing. She co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People (NAP) and worked tirelessly to organize black communities in the fight for political rights and safety. Yet she was not always embraced by her peers. Many considered her too radical, too unyielding. She was often criticized for being confrontational, but she never allowed others to define the limits of her courage. She believed that the fight for justice demanded truth without compromise. Her work connected deeply with the struggles of those who came before her, like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. Each of them had used their voices to challenge the systems that dehumanized their people. Sojourner had spoken the truth of womanhood and strength. Harry had turned resistance into liberation. And Ida carried their legacy into the modern world, using the written word as her battlefield. Where Sojourner's question, "Ain't I a woman?" demanded recognition of humanity, Ida's question was more direct: "Where is your justice?" Together, their voices formed an unbroken line through history, each one building upon the last. Ida B. Wells lived her life as proof that courage was not confined to the battlefield or the pulpit, but could also exist in the printed word, in the act of telling the truth when others are afraid. She faced death threats, public smear campaigns, and isolation, yet she never recanted a single word. Her legacy endures not because of the dangers she faced, but because of the clarity with which she exposed them. She understood that silence protects the powerful, but truth protects the people. By the time she died in 1931, Ida B. Wells had transformed American journalism and paved the way for future generations of activists and writers. Her fearless investigations laid the foundation for modern civil rights movements, and her name continues to inspire those who use their voices to confront injustice. She taught the world that telling the truth, even when it is dangerous, is itself an act of liberation, and that one woman's courage can change not only the headlines of her time, but the moral direction of a nation. In the decades that followed Reconstruction, when the promises of freedom were dimmed by segregation and inequality, a new generation of leaders emerged who refused to let their people's hopes fade into silence. Among them was a woman who understood that true liberation required more than laws and declarations. It demanded knowledge, discipline, and faith. Her name was Mary Quid Bethune, and her belief in the power of education transformed countless lives and reshaped the destiny of a people determined to rise. Born in 1875 in Mayersville, South Carolina, Mary was the 15th of 17 children, most of whom had been born into slavery. Her parents, Samuel and Patsy McLeod, worked tirelessly to build a life from the remnants of bondage, and from them, she learned the value of perseverance. In a world that told her education was not meant for her kind, she saw learning as an act of freedom. When she picked up a book for the first time and realized that she could read the same words once used to control her ancestors, she felt the power that knowledge could bring. It was in that moment that she decided education would be her life's purpose, not only for herself, but for every black child who had been denied that right. Mary's journey began with small steps that required immense courage. She attended a mission school run by the Presbyterian Board of Missions and later earned a scholarship to study at the Scotia Seminary in North Carolina. From there, she continued at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, where she hoped to become a missionary in Africa. But the missionary boards of the time refused to send black women abroad, claiming they were not fit for the task. Instead of surrendering to disappointment, Mary turned her focus inward. If she could not carry education across the ocean, she would build it right at home. In 1904, with just $1.5 in her pocket, faith in her heart, and 5 little girls eager to learn, Mary founded the Daytona Educational and Industrial School for Negro girls in Daytona, Florida. She began the school in a small rented house, using discarded crates for desks and any material she could find to create a classroom. But what she lacked in resources, she replaced with vision. She taught her students not only reading and writing but also the principles of self-respect, hard work, and leadership. She believed that education was not merely about books, but about building character, about preparing young women to become the moral and intellectual backbone of their communities. As the years passed, her school grew from a handful of students into one of the most respected institutions in the South. Through sheer determination and unrelenting advocacy, she gained the support of both black and white philanthropists, among them industrialist John Rockefeller and educator Booker Washington. In 1923, her school merged with the Cookman Institute for Men to become Bethune-Cookman College, a landmark achievement that made her one of the first black women to lead a higher education institution in the United States. But Mary Cleard Bethune was more than an educator. She was a visionary who understood that education could not flourish without opportunity and justice. Her leadership drew the attention of national figures, and she soon became an influential advisor to multiple U.S. presidents. Under Franklin Roosevelt, she was appointed as a national advisor on minority affairs and served as the director of the Division of Negro Affairs within the National Youth Administration, one of the highest positions ever held by a black woman in government at that time. Through this role, she created programs that provided thousands of young African Americans with training, employment, and hope during the Great Depression. Her ability to navigate the halls of power was remarkable. Mary possessed a rare blend of dignity and determination that commanded respect even in rooms filled with skepticism. When she entered a meeting with the president or members of Congress, she did not speak as a petitioner, but as a leader representing a people with rightful demands. She founded the National Council of Negro Women in 1935, uniting dozens of organizations under one voice to advocate for equality, education, and women's empowerment. Her goal was to show that collective strength guided by intelligence and unity could accomplish what isolation never could. Despite her growing influence, Mary never forgot the purpose that had started her journey. She continued to walk among her students, reminding them that knowledge was both a privilege and a responsibility. To her, every classroom was a sacred space where the seeds of freedom were planted. She often said that faith and education must go hand in hand, that one gives strength to the other. Her motto, invest in the human soul. Who knows? It might be a diamond in the rough, reflected her belief that greatness could emerge from the most humble beginnings. Mary Cleard Bethune's work built upon the legacy of women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, B. Wells, where Sojourner had demanded recognition of womanhood, and Harriet had led her people through danger to freedom, and Ida had exposed the truth in a time of silence. Mary transformed that legacy into an enduring institution. She carried their spirit into classrooms and government halls, showing that the power of the mind was the next battlefield in the long struggle for equality. Education, to her, was not a luxury, it was the weapon that would dismantle ignorance, poverty, and prejudice. By the time she passed away in 1955, Mary McLeod Bethune had seen the fruits of her vision take root across the nation. Bethune-Cookman University stood as a living monument to her life's mission, producing generations of graduates who carried her message of service and self-respect. Her influence reached beyond the boundaries of her school, touching the civil rights movement that would rise in the years after her death. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks would inherit the foundation. She helped build the belief that education and moral conviction could transform a nation. Mary's life remains a testament to what can be achieved when knowledge is guided by purpose. She turned barriers into bridges and adversity into opportunity. Through her, the dream of empowerment became tangible, and her story joined the unbroken chain of those who refused to be confined by history. Like Sojourner Truth, Harriet's courage, and Ada's justice, Mary McLeod Bethune's legacy endures, a reminder that the most powerful revolutions begin not on battlefields, but in classrooms where hearts and minds are set free. By the time the winter of 1955 arrived, the movement for justice in America had already been shaped by voices of courage, from Sojourner Truth's unyielding defiance to Harriet Tubman's fearless rescue missions. B. Wells' relentless pursuit of truth. Yet it was in the quiet determination of one woman, sitting on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama, that those echoes of resistance found a new beginning. Rosa Parks did not set out that day to make history. She was tired, but not from the day's work alone. She was tired of a system that demanded her silence, of rules that dictated where she could sit, stand, or even exist. And when the bus driver ordered her to give up her seat to a white passenger, she simply said no. That small word, spoken softly but firmly, became one of the loudest declarations of dignity in modern history. Rosa had grown up in a world that taught her to keep her head down, but she had also grown up listening to stories of courage, stories of people who refused to be broken. She knew the risk that came with saying no, and yet she also knew the cost of always saying yes to injustice. In that moment, her quiet refusal became a spark that lit the fire of the civil rights movement. Word of her arrest spread through Montgomery's black community, and what followed was not chaos, but strategy. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., newly arrived in the city, joined with local organizers and ordinary citizens to plan a boycott of the city's buses. For over a year, men and women walked miles to work, carpooled with strangers, and faced threats, intimidation, and hardship. It was a movement born not from violence, but from unity and endurance, a living example of the power that comes when a community stands together. Rosa Parks became its symbol, but she was never alone. Behind her were hundreds of others who had experienced the same daily humiliations, and now saw in her action a reflection of their own strength. Her courage reminded the world that resistance did not always come with raised fists or shouted words. Sometimes it came with silence, patience, and the refusal to move from one's rightful place. The bus boycott did more than desegregate public transportation, it reshaped the conscience of a nation. The Supreme Court's eventual decision to strike down bus segregation laws was a legal victory. But the greater triumph was spiritual and cultural. It showed that ordinary people, when organized and determined, could bend the arc of history toward justice. Rosa Parks' name became synonymous with dignity, and her calm defiance became a model for countless others who would march, sit, and speak out in the years to come. But the story of Rosa Parks is not simply about one day on a bus. It is about the lifetime that led to that moment and the decades of quiet work that followed. Before her famous act, she had already been an active member of the NAP, investigating cases of racial violence and supporting victims who had no one else to turn to. After the boycott, she continued her work, moving to Detroit and advocating for housing rights, education, and justice for prisoners. She never sought fame or credit. She simply believed in doing what was right, even when the world seemed unmoved. Her calm strength connected deeply to the legacy of women who came before her. Sojourner Truth had demanded recognition of womanhood and humanity. Harriet Tubman had shown that freedom must sometimes be taken rather than given. Ida B. Wells had exposed the brutality that followed when justice was denied. Mary McLeod Bethune had built schools to ensure that the next generation could rise with knowledge and pride. Rosa Parks carried all of them within her, their courage, their discipline, their faith, and in her single act of refusal, she proved that their fight was far from over. In the years that followed, Rosa became known as the mother of the civil rights movement, but she never accepted that title lightly. She saw herself not as a leader set apart, but as one part of a greater whole, a movement of countless men and women whose names history might never record, yet whose actions made freedom possible. Her humility was her power. When asked later what gave her the strength to stay seated that day, she simply said, "I thought of all those who had come before me, and I could not go back." Her story reminds us that resistance can take many forms, sometimes loud and public, sometimes quiet and personal, but its heart is always the same: the belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Rosa Parks showed that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it is found in stillness. Her quiet act on that December evening continues to inspire not only movements for racial justice, but all who struggle against any form of inequality. Through her, the legacy of black women in history became undeniable. They were not simply witnesses to change, they were its creators, each generation passing the torch of freedom to the next. Rosa Parks' story closes one chapter of struggle, but it opens another, a reminder that every act of courage, no matter how small, carries within it the power to move nations. By the time Maya Angelou's words reached the world, the path had already been carved by women like Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Rosa Parks, women who fought for freedom, dignity, and equality not just through defiance, but through creation. They built schools, sparked movements, and spoke truth to power. Yet Maya Angelou added something new to that legacy. She gave it a voice so full of rhythm and grace that it sang across generations. Her pen became her weapon, her shield, and her prayer. Through her writing, especially her groundbreaking memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she gave words to the unspoken pain and resilience of black womanhood. Maya's story began in the Deep South, where the weight of history pressed heavy on every breath. As a child, she faced hardship and silence, the kind of silence that can swallow dreams whole. But out of that silence, she built a language that refused to be contained. Her early years were marked by trauma, yet she found refuge in books, poetry, and the rhythm of her grandmother's voice during Sunday sermons. Words became her companions and later, her salvation. She learned that while the world might try to define her, it could never take away her power to define herself. When she wrote I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings in 1969, she was not just telling her own story. She was telling the story of countless others who had been caged by racism, sexism, or poverty. She showed that the human spirit, even when wounded, could still rise and sing. Her writing was both personal and universal, intimate like a whisper, yet powerful enough to echo across continents. Readers from every background saw themselves in her words because her message was not only about struggle, but about survival, transformation, and grace. Maya Angelou was not only a writer, she was a dancer, an actress, a director, a teacher, and an activist. She lived with an energy that refused to be limited by any single title. Her artistry flowed naturally from the legacy of those who came before her. Like Sojourner Truth, she spoke truth to those who would deny her humanity. Like Harriet Tubman, she led others toward freedom not through secret railroads, but through the power of self-knowledge and pride. Like A.B. Wells, she used her pen to expose the hidden wounds of a nation still learning what justice truly meant. And like Mary Cleard Bethune, she believed deeply in the transformative power of education. Her words often carried a quiet authority that compelled both empathy and introspection. She once said, "I am the dream and the hope of the slave," and in those few words, she tied herself directly to a lineage of strength that began long before her. She was the voice of the generations who had been silenced and a bridge between past and future. When she stood to recite her poem on the pulse of morning at President Bill Clinton's inauguration in 1993, it was not merely a performance, it was history coming full circle. A black woman, who once faced the cruelties of segregation, now stood before the world, speaking of renewal, healing, and the courage to begin again. But Maya Angelou's influence went far beyond politics or literature. She changed how people saw themselves. Her message to young black women was one of profound affirmation. That they were enough, that their voices mattered, and that their stories deserved to be told. She taught that beauty could coexist with pain. That identity was not something to be hidden or reshaped for approval, but something to be embraced in full color. Her voice, deep and resonant, carried the weight of generations and yet felt as personal as a conversation with a friend. Through her teaching and mentorship, she guided countless artists, writers, and thinkers to find their own voices. She believed that courage was the foundation of every virtue, that without it, no truth could be spoken, no love could be given, and no freedom could be claimed. Her life itself became a lesson that the act of creation is an act of resistance, that to write, to speak, to sing is to declare. Here, the world she left behind was different because of her. Through her work, the pain of history became poetry, and the wounds of oppression became lessons in endurance. She took the struggles of her people, the forced silences, the unacknowledged contributions, the resilience carved from centuries of survival, and transformed them into stories that inspired generations to stand taller. Her words connected her to the women who had come before her, and those who would follow. She embodied Sojourner Truth's strength, Harriet Tubman's courage, A.B. Wells' conviction, Mary Cleard Bethune's wisdom, and Rosa Parks' quiet power. Each of these women had fought in her own way to redefine what freedom and dignity could mean. Maya Angelou wove their spirits into her art, proving that storytelling could be as revolutionary as any march or protest. Even now, her voice continues to guide the world through her poetry, lines that celebrate love, resilience, and the simple but radical act of living fully. She wrote, "You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I would." Those words are not just a declaration. They are a promise that no matter how many times the world tries to silence a people or deny their humanity, their spirit will always rise again. In the story of black women who changed history, Maya Angelou stands as both a continuation and a culmination, the living bridge between the struggle for freedom and the celebration of identity. She taught that liberation is not only a political act but a personal one, that every human being holds within them the right to sing, to dream, and to define their own story. Through her life and her art, she gave the caged bird not just a song, but wings strong enough to carry generations forward. When Maya Angelou's words declared that the caged bird would rise, a new generation heard the call and prepared to soar higher. The legacy of courage, intellect, and resistance that had begun with Sojourner Truth and flowed through Harriet Tubman, A.B. Wells, Mary Cleard Bethune, Rosa Parks, and Maya Angelou found a fierce, Brilliant continuation in Angela Davis. She did not inherit their struggle as a burden, but as a mission to challenge not only the visible chains of racism, but also the invisible systems that kept injustice alive. Scholar, activist, and icon of the Black Power era, Angela Davis became a symbol of defiance and thought proof that resistance was not only fought in the streets, but also shaped in classrooms, books, and ideas that refused to conform. Angela was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in a neighborhood the locals called Dynamite Hill, because homes of black families were often bombed by those who resented their determination to live with dignity. From an early age, she learned that survival required both courage and understanding. Her parents were educators and activists, teaching her that knowledge could be a weapon more powerful than fear. By the time she entered her teenage years, the civil rights movement was in full motion, and she was already questioning not just the cruelty of segregation, but the deeper systems that made such cruelty possible. She studied philosophy under the great Herbert Marcuse, whose teachings about social justice and revolution opened new dimensions of thought. But Angela Davis was not content with theories alone. She believed that ideas were only meaningful if they could change the world. When she returned to the United States after studying in Germany, she found a nation still bleeding from racial division and economic inequality. The dream that Rosa Parks had sparked in Montgomery had not yet been fulfilled. The promise of freedom that Harriet Tubman had risked everything for still remained unfinished. Angela's role was to confront that unfinished work, to question why so many were still left behind. In the late 1960s, America was a nation of contradictions filled with voices demanding peace and equality, yet still clinging to old systems of power. Angela joined the Communist Party USA and became associated with the Black Panther movement, aligning herself with those who saw liberation as more than the right to sit or vote. It was the right to live free from fear, hunger, and injustice. Her intelligence, her natural eloquence, and her fearlessness drew both admiration and hostility. To some, she represented progress. To others, she was a threat, but to those who knew her cause, she embodied the strength of generations before her. When she was accused of aiding an armed uprising in 1970, she became one of the most famous political prisoners in the world. Her face appeared on posters across continents, and the rallying cry "Free Angela Davis" became a global movement. From Africa to Europe to Latin America, people marched in solidarity with a woman they had never met but whose courage they instantly recognized. During her imprisonment, she wrote, read, and taught, refusing to let confinement silence her mind. When she was eventually acquitted, she emerged not defeated but renewed, ready to continue her fight for justice with even greater clarity. Her activism evolved with time. Angela Davis became a leading advocate for prison reform, arguing that true justice could never exist in a system built on punishment rather than rehabilitation. She exposed how mass incarceration disproportionately targeted black and poor communities, continuing the legacy of control that slavery had once enforced. Her voice resonated not just in America but around the world, connecting struggles for freedom across nations and cultures. She reminded people that liberation was not a single event but a constant effort, a thread woven through every generation that dared to dream of equality. Angela Davis's influence went beyond politics. She became an intellectual force, a scholar who taught that knowledge itself was an act of rebellion when it challenged oppression. Her lectures and writings explored the intersection of race, gender, and class subjects that would shape academic and activist conversations for decades to come. Yet despite her fame, she remained grounded in her commitment to community and to truth. She stood for those without a platform, amplifying voices that had long been ignored. Her legacy mirrors that of the women who came before her, each one shaping the next chapter of the same story. Sojourner Truth spoke of womanhood and humanity in a time when neither was acknowledged. Harriet Tubman proved that courage could defy the impossible. Ida B. Wells fought lies with facts and exposed the violence of hate. Mary McLeod Bethune built schools so that others could rise through knowledge. Rosa Parks showed the world that quiet defiance could move mountains. Maya Angelou transformed pain into poetry, teaching the world how to rise. And Angela Davis, she united the spirit of all of them, embodying both intellect and resistance. Fire and grace. Even today, her message continues to inspire new generations. Her words echo through movements for racial justice, gender equality, and prison reform around the world. Young activists quote her ideas, build upon her theories, and carry forward her unrelenting belief in collective power. Her story is not one of rebellion for its own sake, but of love for truth, for freedom, and for humanity. In Angela Davis, the long arc of Black women's history finds both its reflection and its renewal. She stands as proof that every era produces its own voice of courage, that the struggles begun by those who came before are never forgotten, only transformed. Her life teaches that to challenge the world is not to reject it, but to demand that it become better, fairer, and more human. Through her intellect and her activism, Angela Davis reminds us that the spirit of liberation, once awakened, never dies. It evolves, it adapts, and it continues to inspire, just as it has from Sojourner Truth to this very day. From the earliest cries of resistance to the eloquent songs of freedom, the story of Black women in history has always been one of transformation, of taking pain and shaping it into power, of turning invisibility into influence. It began with voices like Sojourner Truth, who demanded to be seen as both Black and woman, with Harriet Tubman, who risked everything to lead others to safety, with Ada Wells, who used truth as her armor, with Mary McLeod Bethune, who built schools of hope from the dust of poverty, with Rosa Parks, who showed the world that calm defiance could shake an empire, with Maya Angelou, who gave language to dignity itself, and with Angela Davis, who carried their torch into the modern age of activism and thought. And then came Michelle Obama, a woman who stood at the intersection of all that history, carrying generations of dreams into the most visible stage on earth. When Michelle Obama became the First Lady of the United States, she did not simply step into a political role, she embodied a symbol that redefined what Black womanhood could look like in the eyes of the world. Her presence in the White House was a quiet revolution, one that did not need to shout to be heard. Through grace, intellect, and unwavering authenticity, she reminded millions that strength and elegance were never opposites, they were the essence of survival. Michelle's journey began in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side, where her parents taught her that education was the foundation of freedom. Her story was not one of privilege, but of persistence, a belief that excellence could be both a personal duty and a collective act of resistance. As she rose from Princeton to Harvard Law School, and later to positions of leadership and service, she carried with her the lessons of every woman who had fought before her, to rise not only for oneself, but for others. As first, she transformed the belief into action. Her initiatives in education and health, from Let Us Move to Reach Higher, were not mere campaigns. They were blueprints for empowerment. She spoke to young people about the power of learning, to women about the importance of self-worth, and to families about the meaning of care and balance. She understood that the legacy of progress was not built in speeches or ceremonies, but in the daily acts of nurturing, teaching, and inspiring. Yet what made Michelle Obama truly extraordinary was not only what she did, but how she did it. She faced scrutiny, stereotypes, and expectations that few could imagine. And through it all, she remained grounded, using her platform to uplift rather than to retaliate. She showed the world that dignity itself could be an act of defiance, that being confident, articulate, and compassionate as a Black woman in power was a statement louder than any protest. In her, the echoes of those who came before resounded clearly. You could hear Sojourner Truth's courage when Michelle spoke about equality, Harriet Tubman's resolve in her commitment to community. Ida B. Wells' precision in her words. Mary McLeod Bethune's vision in her focus on education. Rosa Parks' quiet strength in her composure. Maya Angelou's grace in her storytelling. And Angela Davis' conviction in her call for justice. She was, in many, the embodiment of all of them, not as a reflection of the past, but as a continuation of it. When she said, "When they go low, we go," it was more than a phrase, it was the distilled wisdom of centuries. It was Sojourner's voice in a modern tongue, Harriet's determination dressed in diplomacy, Maya's poetry turned into policy. In her, the long arc of history bent toward visibility, respect, and empowerment. She redefined leadership not as dominance but as service, and reminded millions that the truest power lies in the ability to inspire. Michelle Obama's legacy will endure not only because of the programs she built or the speeches she gave, but because she changed the way generations of young girls, especially black girls, saw themselves. She taught them that brilliance and kindness could coexist, that ambition was not arrogance, and that self-love was not vanity but survival. Through her, the world learned that the story of black womanhood was never about struggle alone, it was about triumph, creativity, and grace under fire. And so, as we close this journey through the lives of extraordinary women from the fields of enslavement to the halls of power, we see one unbroken thread: the will to rise. Each woman, in her own time, redefined what it meant to be free, to be strong, to be human. Their legacies remind us that history is not a distant past but a living inheritance, one that continues to grow every time someone dares to stand, to speak, or to dream. If these stories have moved you, if they have reminded you of the power of courage, faith, and perseverance, then let their message live on. Help share their light, because their stories belong not only to history, but to the future we build together. Thank you for being part of this journey, for listening, for remembering, and for keeping their spirit alive. If you believe in stories that uplift and inspire, that honor those who turned pain into progress and silence into song, then do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Together, we can make sure their voices continue to echo not just in memory, but in action, in hope, and in every heart that dares to rise.